Hey, NOSA committee, it is Shamika and I am back and welcome to our YouTube channel. We're glad to have you here. If you've been checking out our channel, checking out some of the videos, whether it's been done from myself or others, just go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and click that subscribe button there, as well as click the alert bell to get updates on some of our latest topics this month and into the summer. One of the things that we've decided to do in this particular summer is to really dive into some of the nuts and bolts of what it means to start a healthcare staffing business, as well as get yourself from launched to actually operating. And that's always a little bit of a challenge that people sometimes can move fast too swiftly, but are key components that allow you not only to go from launching to operating, but also to make sure that your business has all the pieces in place. So we talked about marketing and recruitment strategies. We've also talked about presentation skills and a plethora of other topics that are related to you as an individual owner and or co-owner. And now we're going to talk about your policies and procedures and kind of why you need them in your business, as well as highlight some of the things or key areas that you want to make sure that you have in place for your particular agency. So welcome. Thank you for all our new subscribers, as well as our members over at our Facebook group over there. And if you haven't had a chance, you can click on the F for Facebook and join our Facebook group where we have thousands of fellow NOSAs, ICOSAs, all types of medium to small size agency owners in the healthcare staffing business. And it gives you an opportunity to really connect with people locally or virtually to get some more information about the process, no matter where you are in the process. So let's get started on our topic, which is about policies and procedures for your staffing agency. So when you think about staffing agencies and how you need to develop policies and procedures, a key thing to take into consideration really is the fact that our business has a little bit of uniqueness. So one of the things that we traditionally see in policies and procedures is just kind of how the business runs. So how the business runs internally, how they onboard employees, how employees are screened or able to become compliant or meet compliance requirements, and a lot of that process. But you also want to take into consideration the other pieces of the industry where we talk about the healthcare piece. So any sort of immunizations or any sort of vaccination requirements, those are all things that you want to make sure that you include in your policies and procedures, so that as whether it's other people within your internal organization or outside, they can kind of say, hey, when I join this organization, these are the steps and these are the processes that we go to. I will tell people sometimes your policies and procedures can parallel your employee manual, but your manual typically is more of a condensed version or overview of your policies and procedures. And your policies and procedures should really be like that step by step, clearly outlined. If I come into your organization, I can grab your policies and procedures and really get in-depth information about those different steps in the process, including regulations, making sure that you're operating ethically, any sort of legal requirements, any sort of EEOC, diversity, sexual harassment. Those are typically things that you would see in an individual's policies and procedures. So during this presentation, we'll talk about some of the highlighted areas that you want to make sure is included, but overall, you want to include how your business runs, how it's set up, where it's located. Organizational structures can be included in your policies and procedures, and more of the step-by-step process, especially for employees entering your organization. So some things that you want to include in your policies and procedures, and some of this is at the state level or federal level, depending on how big your organization is, but you always want to have anti-discrimination policies set forth. Staffing agencies must comply, just like any other businesses, with anti-discrimination policies set forth by your specific state and federal laws. And essentially, it's a policy that discusses things around why you cannot discriminate against job seekers, that you create a fair, consistent process or hiring process for applicants, and that applicants aren't discriminated against based on their race, gender, age, religion, disability, and any other protected characteristics. And I'll talk a little bit more about that to give people more of an idea of what that means. Is that if you're hiring for a nurse or hiring for a CNA, your hiring process, in addition to meeting these requirements, needs to be consistent no matter what the person is. So you don't want to bring in someone and just be like, oh, yeah, you're hired. You haven't done a reference check. Maybe they haven't done a drug screen. You haven't verified their license. Um, those are areas where you'll put yourself at risk for discriminating, or you only have a staff that includes these types of people but doesn't include these other types of people who have applied to jobs for your organization. And another way to kind of manage your any sort of anti-discrimination policies is also to have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies where it talks about, hey, these are the steps our organization is going to take to be more inclusive. We're going to attend different conferences or be a part of different events where we can have in place within our organization at various levels a diverse group of people with different backgrounds, race, religion, age, gender, so on and so forth. The next one is you want to make sure that your particular policies and procedures are in compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act. And all staffing agencies and businesses must comply, and it's governed the employees' rights, such as minimum wage and overtime pay. Staffing agencies are responsible for ensuring that employees are in the right job classification. And probably later on, as we go into June, we'll talk about that whole conversation around 1099 versus W-2, that they're also correctly identified as exempt, which is typically your salaried or non-exempt, and they're paid accordingly, and any other compliance or FLSA regulations. And two things to keep into consideration when we talk about specifically the minimum wage and overtime pay. So this is just like your general employee for the most part. But when you're talking about travelers, that's like a different conversation. How to develop and create travelers pay. What are the things that you take into consideration? There are still minimum requirements, GSA standards around non-taxable pay payments and things like that. So there's a different process, and we'll do that as a different video. But this is just kind of talking about your local or per diem staff, making sure that they're getting whatever the minimum wage may be in your respective state, as well as overtime pay. And that's also state specific. For the most part, there are some states where overtime doesn't start at 40. Maybe it starts after 8 or after 12 hours. And then holiday pay could be look different. So holiday pay would definitely be inclusive of a overtime or special type of play covered through FLSA. Next, you want to include any benefits. So any employee benefits that you may have or offer, you want to include that as information in your policies and procedures. Some staffing agencies, I'm sure you guys do, offer benefits to their employees, including health insurance, retirement plans, and other fringe or non-traditional types of benefits. And it's the employee's responsibility to kind of outline what those are, as well as how your employees qualify for them. So some employers say, hey, after 90 days, you can qualify for these types of employee benefits. But some may say their first day one, you're eligible. So you want to make sure that there's a communication process in place to let employees know their eligibility, and then any next steps that they may have to do to participate. So, and this can include other benefits. Some people offer AFLEC types of benefits, any sort of PTO. And speaking of PTO, there's quite a few states over the last quarter that have implemented things at the state level requiring employers who have X number of employees to offer paid time off or sick leave. So you want to make sure that you're not only meeting the requirements at the federal level, but at the state level, especially if your state is saying that, hey, if you have 10 employees, they work 40 hours a week, they're eligible for 0.5 hours of sick leave. I know recently we saw, and I'll share in our community tab, we saw New York introduce a bill around that. And I think there was a couple of other states. So you want to make sure that you are staying in compliance with that and have a process for those employees to accrue and be able to use those types of leaves. Transparency with employment contracts. So when we talk about employment contracts, we're talking about any contracts that you have between yourself as the agency and the employee to do contracted work. So this isn't really talking or touching on anything related to between the agency and the client. So this is, hey, this person is going to go do a local contract for 10 weeks or 13 weeks, that type of thing. And many times, and I'm guilty of it myself, employment contract, employment agreement, offer letter are used interchangeably. But however you use it, you just want to give some explanation as to what it means. So typically, your employment contracts clearly outline all terms and conditions of employment and contracts that are signed by candidate and agency. And I gave the example of what we were referring to. And in that case, we would definitely want to make sure that you include pay rates, work schedules, job duties, any sort of termination or reduction conditions. And I'll touch on that in a minute. The contract should also include provisions that protect rights of both the employee and the agency. So termination conditions really are talking about where if the employee may be on a contract where it's a 40-hour guarantee or 36-hour guarantee, you want to make sure in the language it includes if the person worked less than those hours, what that process looks like. In offer letters, where we see that more of your like per diem spaces, you want to make sure that you include, hey, you're being paid weekly or daily pay, terms around, upon receiving, accurate, properly completed timesheets. So those are things that you want to think about when you're talking about the employment contracts. And then any other things tied to it. And again, we're not talking about travel contracts, so it's a whole different beast, but we're specifically talking about local per diem types of contracts for employees to go out and work for your clients. The next subtitle you want to make sure that's in your policies and procedures will be around compliance with any sort of immigration laws. Immigration laws are typically at the federal and state level governing foreign employment. And part of this is done and kind of taken care of or verified, as we mentioned here, during the hiring process and the very beginning process of onboarding right before the person starts. So that looks like the I-9s, the forms related to I-9s, verifying that they're eligible to work in the United States, and that they have the appropriate documentation to do so, appropriate credentials, compliance, all of those things are complete. I-9 forms are, on lines to complete. The main thing that I would say employers or NOSAs should be mindful of would be around making sure that they're completed correctly. So there's lots of companies out there that'll do that piece for you. But if you decide to do it in-house, you want to make sure that you complete it correctly and that you've communicated to your potential employee, that process. Whether it be that they have to have it notarized or authorized or signed by a third party. As during the pandemic, we saw a lot of that since we weren't doing in-person types of things where it may or may not be handled in-house. And like I said in the beginning, whatever process that you have, you just want to be consistent with it. So if you have a company like Augusto, do that process for you. They'll kind of handle the communicating with the employee and getting that information authorized. And then the last thing, which is the case about anything that you do under your policies and procedures, is the maintenance of those documents. So that would be no different than licenses or CPR cards or certifications. So confidentiality and data protection. This is a great segue. Staffing agencies must protect the privacies of job workers, especially more now than ever. I feel like access and data breaches have been a big thing, especially in the healthcare space. And you want to make sure that you, as an employer, have a process of how you're going to maintain people's personal information. And we're not just talking about healthcare, we're talking about licensing, address, date of birth, social security card, social security numbers that'll appear on some documents, banking information. So I encourage people to be mindful, of saving information, or even employees of the organization saving information on desktops, sending confidential emails without any sort of confidentiality or encryption, storing and protecting the data to make sure it's secured, limiting access. So, like, only making sure that certain individuals have access for like payroll processing. Similar to what we see with HIPAA, it's an as needed thing. So, everybody doesn't need to have access, but it's your responsibility to make sure that those who need it have it, and then how much access they have. The last few things we're going to touch on around what should be in your policies and procedures is kind of your code of ethics, your professional conduct. And we typically see this at the very beginning. And this kind of sets the expectation from the agency to the employee of what it means to provide professional conduct and maintain a code of ethics. In our industry, that's a big deal. So it kind of slides in between, from the agency to the facility. So it's a consistent piece, but you want to be clear as far as, what's professional conduct, what's professional dress, what's professional hair. If your client has any special uniform requirements, that's something that you would want to include. And it's not, and if you don't know, you just want to include language around saying that, hey, this is what's considered professional dress: scrub, rubber shoes, scrub top, any color, unless special requests are made by the client to, to wear a specific color. Notification will be given to the employee and communicated the process. Making sure that you're treating all parties, including patients and customers, with respect, honesty, fairness, and avoiding any conflicts of interest. And when you talk about conflicts of interest, it's always nice. And this is where you would maybe give more examples in an employee orientation of what that looks like for our industry. Hey, if you worked for a facility and now you work for us, and you're sharing information about our operations. Um, the code of ethics also serves as a guide with making ethical decisions. Again, the best way for people to many times make the connection is to give examples. So these are spaces that during employee orientation, I would give examples. And the last slide that's not on here that I would include would be policies and procedures around social media. Social media has been a big player in our industry. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but we want to make sure that there's communication and, again, examples in your handbook and your orientation around like what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, just to set the expectation so that there's no confusion around what you do if there's any sort of violation, what the outcomes could be, any sort of disciplinary steps or processes. That's also should be in your policies and procedures. But for the most part, we're just kind of highlighting here in this presentation some of the commonly added highlights to your policies within your organization. You really can't add as much as you need to or take away where you need to, but you want to make sure that you're hitting those points, especially early on, so that you're in compliance. And then it creates kind of a great framework for you to create then your employee manual, which typically is kind of a snippet of those items. And then, of course, creating any sort of employee orientation. So you want to keep all those things in mind. So if you enjoy the information we shared here today, definitely feel free to follow us on all our social media platforms, including check out our website as we have updates about NOSACON 2024, along with some new products we're rolling out this summer. And as always, feel free to also follow us here on our YouTube channel. We're glad to have you here and be a part of our growing community. And feel free to share it with a friend. The healthcare industry, which is a big conversation happening throughout our industry, is growing and it's changing. And I think always with change, it can be a tough process initially, but I do think that the changes we're seeing in our industry is definitely for the greater good. And once things settle down, which I would say they haven't quite yet, we'll see the benefits or reap the benefits of some of those changes we saw through the industry, whether it be through staffing regulations or um, more information around processing ratios and technology. So let's continue the conversation. Make sure to click that bell so you can get alerts on our next presentation. And if you have any topics you want me to cover, definitely feel free to reach out in the comments or message me on one of the other social media platforms, and we'll definitely talk more about any topics that you might be interested in hearing more about. As always, thanks for being a part of our community, and I will be chatting with you.